Welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. Thrilled to be with you today for the virtual reading group. There's always exciting moments in the virtual reading group. Sometimes it's exciting when we begin a book, and sometimes exciting when we end a book. Today we're ending a book, or at least ending a part of an unfinished book. The Life of the Mind. This is a book that Arendt was writing at the end of her life, never did finish. It's edited by her good friend and first literary executor, Marion McCarthy, who great writer on her own right. There is a new version of it coming out, edited by two of my friends, Wout Cornelissen and Thomas Barcher, in the critical edition of Hannah Arendt. They will be making a lot of textual changes in the sense that, there's a lot of things that Marion McCarthy changed or that were unclear, and they've discovered a lot of interesting changes. There'll be a whole apparatus. So if you're interested in this book, this is a great time to, when that new book comes out, take a look at it and see what you can find. That said, the book is divided into three parts: thinking, willing, and judging. The part on judging has never been written. We're going to try and explore that going forward, starting February 11th. We are finishing today part 2 on judging. Part 2 on willing. Someone's got to keep me honest besides myself. And so I thought it would be good to try and just remind ourselves a little bit of what we've done and where we're coming from. So the book, again, is The Life of the Mind, and it's about 3 faculties of the mind: thinking, willing, and judging. And if you recall way back, we learned that thinking is predominantly concerned with the question and the quest for meaning. The need of reason, we read many times, talked about. The need of reason is not inspired by the quest for truth, but by the quest for meaning. And so we really spent a lot of time in that first few month or two reading this book, asking about when you think and you withdraw from the world and you move out of the world, and yet you're still kept in the world insofar as you think through language, which is metaphorical and thus ties us back to the world. We're not actually trying to achieve any kind of truth. We're trying to understand, to think, what is the meaning of the world. And that is the sort of focus of volume 1. Volume 2 is on willing. And, for those of you who've read a lot of Hannah Arendt, which I think is many of you, or at least some of you, thinking is a big part of Arendt's writing. If you read her work, whether it's early work like the Human Condition, or even later work, thinking is at the center of it. Willing is not, right? We don't hear about willing so much in Arendt's work. And yet, why does she write this volume on willing? Well, I think there's a couple of reasons, but a part of her work that you all know very well is her focus on the question of freedom. And the problem of the will, she says at the very beginning of this volume on will, is the problem of freedom. So if freedom is so important to Arendt, and yet will seems so absent in her work, why is that? Well, there's a good reason for that. The reason is that insofar as the problem of freedom is approached through the problem of willing, we miss what freedom is. That's actually the argument here. Willing is about the problem of freedom, but it's a misappropriation or misapprehension of the problem of freedom. Why? Because we approach freedom through the will largely as philosophers and thinkers. It's professional philosophers who imagine freedom as connected with the will. And these philosophers, and by the way, it's philosophers and theologians. And theologians insofar as they are thinkers. It's people who think about freedom, who say, oh, well, when we are free, we are willing to do something, and yet there's always a counter will, whether that counter will is in Paul's telling or Augustine's telling or eventually in Nietzsche's telling or Heidegger's telling. The will is a problem, as we want to will freedom, and yet we also are caught with necessity or caught with a counter will or caught with what we think we should will or reason. And the philosophers have, in a sense, I was going to use a bad word. I have to think of another word. But they've circumscribed freedom and made it a question of the will, and thus a question of our mental faculties. And so in a book on the life of the mind and our mental faculties, it's maybe necessary to have an entire volume on the will. But this volume on the will is really, a counter story for Arendt. It's exactly how we should not think about freedom, with one exception, right? And that exception is the chapter on Duns Scotus, which is sort of the glaring example of the one thinker she finds in the entire history of philosophical thought, who understands that the will cannot be subjugated to reason, and that will is not, and that freedom is not just a product of the will, but is something deeply active in the world, contingent, unexpected, new. And so after this entire 15 chapters on the will and the faculty of willing, in which 14 of them, are about how philosophers don't actually address freedom because they subjugate freedom to willing, with the one exception of Scotus. We now, in this final chapter, called The Abyss of Freedom and the Novus Ordo Secularum, we have Arendt come out and say, well, there's another way to think about freedom. And we have to free freedom, and thus even the will, not free, we have to free freedom from the will, and thus free freedom from thinkers and philosophers. And thus, she says on page 198, we turn away from the history of freedom understood as the history of willing through the history of philosophy, and turn to the men of action. And she says that if we turn to the men of action, to political thinkers and political actors, we see that there's an entire other way of thinking about freedom, not as freedom as free will and constrained in the will, but freedom as power. Now, she finds hints of this in the work of Baron von Montesquieu, the French, what do you want to call him? Thinker, political thinker. Some call him a founder of sociology. But Montesquieu, in his Spirit of the Laws, says that freedom is not about will, says it very explicitly, but says that freedom is about power. Political liberty consists in safety, at one point he says, but he also says that it consists in a kind of power to do what you want to do, or as Jefferson rephrases it, in a line that Arendt quotes below, it is the freedom is about the power to do what we ought to do what we ought to will. It's a power to do. Arendt, this approach to freedom through Montesquieu is something that Arendt develops fully, at least more fully, in her book on revolution, and also in her essay, What is Freedom? And in various versions of that essay, there's a number of versions of that essay in which she really does dig deep into Montesquieu and John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. And these are the thinkers that she finds articulating this other view of freedom, not associated with the will, but with power. She makes a number of moves here, starting on page 200 to about 202, where she says that if freedom is power, freedom means that it's has to be connected to power, and power is always connected to a we, a community, a civitas. As she says in other places, power is to act in concert. And she repeats that here, I think on 201. Yeah, 201. And so acting in concert means that we act together. And if we act together, it's a group of people acting together, and it's not everybody in the world. So it assumes the foundational idea of plurality. And that if we are going to act together, such that we will create something new, bring in a new world to be, a new politics to be, there must be a we. I mean, how do we know who we are, who are going to act together? I mean, this is a question that many of you know, has been raised by Rousseau, right? Also by Jacques Derrida in his reading of the American Declaration of Independence. Who is the we when we, the people of the United States of America, or in the Constitution? Who are the we, and how does this we come about? And Arendt here, says this is the question, right? If you want to understand the question of freedom, we have to understand that freedom is power. Power is we. Power is we is acting in concert. We means that we are a people and we have a beginning. And so if we want to understand freedom, we have to understand that freedom means to act, to start something new, to begin. And we then are struck with the political question of beginning, of how does a people begin something new? And she says we can turn to two foundation legends, which is where, our stories of beginnings, at least in the West, are articulated. One is the Hebrew Bible with Genesis, and the other is the Roman Republic and Virgil's Aeneid, among other things. And these two foundation legends, she says, despite all of their differences, and obviously there's many differences, share a common structure, which seems to determine all thinking about political freedom and power since both Genesis and the Roman Republic. And that structure is very simple. It begins with liberation. It includes a hiatus where the liberation is not yet accomplished what it seeks. And it ends with the foundation of freedom in a new, a revolutionary new body politic. And so in Genesis, you have the liberation from Pharaoh and the flight from Egypt. And then you have the coming down from Masada and the giving of a new law of freedom. And in Rome, you have the destruction and annihilation of Troy, and you have Aeneas's many years of wandering, and then you have the foundation of the lawful Roman Republic. These two legends, she says, are the two legends that actors, men of action in the 18th century turned back to in order to explore and confront and try to solve the great question that they were struggling with, which is how to found a free government. They confronted what she calls an abyss, and that's the title of this chapter, The Abyss of Freedom. What is the abyss? The abyss is, how do we, in a secular, post-religious, post-metaphysical age, when we can't rely on God and we can't rely on a Hegelian being or a kind of philosopher's God, even of Kant, how do we, who can't say that the new free republic that we want to create will be caused by science or God or anything, how do we found a free republic? And so this is on page 207. She says that when men of action confronted this question, how to create a new order, and they confronted what she calls on the bottom of 207, the point to the abyss of nothingness that opens up before any deed that cannot be accounted for by a reliable chain of cause and event, right? What they did is they turned back to the last people who freed themselves, wandered in the desert, wandered through Italy, and then founded freedom. And, they a lot of these folks, she says, sought solace in the idea of a transcendent religion. They talked about a civic religion or a civic God or divine men. And she quotes John Adams' Massachusetts Constitution on page 209, which talked about future states of rewards and punishment. But in the end, she says, they didn't rely on that. They relied on a kind of return to Rome, a return to the example of Rome and the Hebrews, Jews, as a way to conduct, this is on page 211, to conduct human affairs without the help of a transcendent God. Now, obviously, if you want to explore this further, there's 50 pages written on this in her book on revolution, and there's 10 pages written on it in her essay, What is Freedom? And so, this is going to be, what she does here is highly concentrated and reduced. But the basic idea here is that what the Romans understood is that freedom is, as a spontaneous foundation of a new birth, is always a return back to beginnings, back to principles, back to founders, back to a core principle that had been lost and needs to be reasserted and rebirthed and re-renaissanced, if you will. And so what the American founders, who she thinks were the greatest men of action who returned to Rome in their thinking about how to found a new republic and a new free government, turned back to Rome and sought the answers of Rome. Again, there's 50 or 60 or maybe actually 100 pages written on this in the 2 chapters on Constitution in On Revolution. And so, we've talked about that when we've read On Revolution. I can't do it all here, but we can bring it out in the Q&A. But the fundamental idea is that you need to constitute power being freedom, power being a we, and you need to constitute authority. And she found that the Americans understood power as freedom in the act of constituting, of setting up, of establishing a new government with multiple power sources through a federalist idea and a republican form of government that was self-government. And she found the Americans turned to and discovered the idea of authority, auctoritas, in the Roman Senate, in which was largely inhabited by patriarchs who could tie their lineage back to the founders of Rome, and thus were like a constant refounding in the Senate. And that she says the Americans transferred the principle of authority from the Senate to the Supreme Court, such that the judges on the Supreme Court would be a constant refounding of the Constitution when they met and talked about the Constitution. And that they would, in a sense, personify the spirit of the foundation of the founders going forward as a living constitution and a living Constitution Assembly in the Supreme Court. And so that's how she imagines this happening. She then, on page 216 in a quintessentially, Arendtian move, after talking about this, says, this does not concern us here. It's been the last 20 pages. And she says, what we really are interested in, when we directed our attention to the men of action, hoping to find in them a notion of freedom, purged from the perplexities caused for men's minds by the reflexivity of mental activities, namely willing, we hoped for more than we finally achieved. So we went on this digression into Rome and Genesis and the problem of founding and revolution in order to try and solve a problem, right? What is freedom outside of the mind, outside of willing? And we couldn't get there because in the end, it's a problem. It's not something that can be solved. She says the abyss of pure spontaneity, bridged by the hiatus between liberation and the Constitution of freedom, was covered up by the device typical of the Occidental tradition of understanding the new as an improved restatement of the old. In a sense, freedom is simply a revolution in the old sense of a rebirth, a refounding. And so that doesn't get us to the problem of freedom. It doesn't get us there. She says the one place where it seems in the whole tradition where somebody sort of thought, I got it, here's freedom, is Augustine in the City of God, right? Which she says is the ontological underpinning for the entire philosophy of politics. I mean, this is an extraordinary reading of Augustine. It's obviously core to Arendt's own personal thought. I mean, no one else would have ever done this. But to argue that Augustine in the City of God provides the ontological founding to human politics is extraordinary. But that's what she's arguing here. And it's in the single sense that Arendt obviously was deeply moved by and talked about for 40 years of her writing, which is that there be a beginning, man was created, before whom nobody was. Initium ergo ut esset creatus est homo ante quem nullis fuit. That there was a beginning, that there was freedom, man was created. And she says this is in essence saying man is doomed to be free. Man is doomed to be free. It's simply a fact that man is free. And here, of course, Arendt rejects all scientific understandings of man, all metaphysical understandings of man as caught up in a kind of necessity of all Heideggerian man as, called to and responding to being. She rejects all readings of man which see man as part of mankind. And she says, man was created to be free. And that is her, in a sense, refutation of the entire history of willing, as it's been presented in this book. Okay, I'm gonna stop there. I think I've tried to make some of this as clear as I can for myself and hopefully for you. There are two ways that you guys can engage in the conversation, as you all know. One is through the chat. Please be respectful. And it's a great chat. It's always very active. And the other is by going down to the reactions button and clicking on raise your hand, and I will call on you in the order that you have points or questions to make. Great. Stephen Greenleaf, you're up first.
Thanks. Very interesting as usual. You uttered a word that I read to the end looking to find, and that is Rousseau. And the idea of the general and common will, and she ignores that. And I'm really surprised, and I think that's a cop-out in some sense. It seems to go along with her almost infatuation with founding and looking towards the past. But it seems to me, the important as those foundations are, that going forward from the past, from the founding, is the even perhaps greater challenge. Look at the US founding, which she obviously admired. We had to go forward with the, burden of what our founders did in acknowledging and building slavery, for instance, into our constitutional order. So I mean, she just leaves this, to me, that's just a gaping hole in her appraisal here, and not answering the question that she seems to raise as, okay, we have to have power, to have freedom, but that is to act into the future. That is a matter of willing. What is the, we often talk about political will, and she ignores these issues, and that vexes me.
Thanks. So first of all, Hannah Arendt writes a fair bit about Jean-Jacques Rousseau, right? And if you want to know what she says about Rousseau and freedom, I direct you simply to On Revolution and to the essay, What is Freedom? Both of which are, can be read as refutations of Rousseau, right? Which is not to say that Rousseau is not great. He is a great thinker, and she takes him very seriously. But Arendt reads Rousseau in What is Freedom as the quintessential example of a political thinker who's under the spell of the philosophical tradition of freedom as will, and thus reads politics and subordinates politics to what Rousseau calls a general will, which is exactly what Arendt rebels against, the idea that there is a kind of quasi-scientific, metaphysical right will, that if we all had access to it, we would all know is our will and right, and what it means to engage in politics is to subordinate ourselves to that general will. And if we refuse we must be forced to be free, right? That's Rousseau's argument in the social contract. And that line that we must be forced to be free, in a sense, which means we must force to will what we should will, is what repulses Arendt. Now, obviously, there are many Rousseauians who try and I'm not, who make an effort to say that's not what Rousseau meant, and et cetera, et cetera. And Rousseau is a much more complicated thinker. Arendt is not trying to do a dissertation on Rousseau. She simply sees Rousseau as a stand-in for the philosophical tradition that rejects freedom in the name of reason, or recalibrates freedom as necessarily rational, and then in Arendt's reading rejects freedom. That's, so that's her reading of Rousseau. That doesn't mean she doesn't believe in the importance of going forward, right? I mean, clearly, her argument is that we need to found freedom, and her argument about founding freedom is that to found freedom means to found it in a way that we're not caught up, that on the one hand we have authority, but we're not so subordinate to the authority that we can't change. And that's why in her arguments about the Constitution of Freedom in chapters 4 and 5 of On Revolution, she puts so much emphasis on both power and authority, and on sort of the constant tension between them, and that the brilliance of authority in the American tradition, in her view, right? Her view is that it was a kind of authority that could change, because it was an authority situated in a living institution, not in a dead God, namely the Supreme Court. And so that was her argument there. So yeah, I mean, the reason, Rousseau has talked a lot about Arendt. She sees Rousseau as the political example of the thinker who's under the sway of the philosophers in their understanding of freedom, and thus doesn't really understand freedom. In this book, he doesn't show up because she's talking about the philosophical tradition, and then in this last chapter, she's talking about the men of action who get it right. Rousseau could have been a thinker in her account of will, but she didn't include him, and he's not a traditional philosopher. He's more of a political philosopher. He's the philosopher who got it wrong. So that's why he's not here. Stephen.
Thank you, Roger. On page 203, Arendt says there's no foundation legend in Greek antiquity. Well, we know she was well versed in Greek poetry.
Yeah.
And she quotes from Oedipus at Colonus at the end of On Revolution in a very prominent way. And it seems to me that there is a foundation legend in Aeschylus's Oresteia, when Athena creates a court to judge in the case of the Furies versus Orestes. And this is very much a foundation. It's giving a divine sanction to the Areopagus, which was the standing public forum and court. And I wonder why Arendt did not refer to that. Did she not think that this was a foundation legend? What do you think is the reason for that?
So, I'm not sure how to answer that, except to say it's a good question. She never said why she didn't think of that. And so, I'm left with Do I try and speak for her and think of a reason, which could be her reason or not? I think what I'll say is this. Arendt, Arendt didn't think that the Greek philosophers had a concept of freedom, right? She thinks that freedom really emerges with the Romans.
Right.
And she thinks that Plato and Aristotle were too caught up in reason and not freedom, right? So the poets, right? And she says that she says that the one legend she mentions here that could have been was Plato's Timaeus, right? Which is again a philosophical legend of founding, not a poetic one. Why she doesn't consider the poetic founding of Athens by in the Oresteia is a good question. And I'm not sure I have. I mean, it's one I'd like to think about, to be honest. I just don't. I haven't, and I'm not sure I can come up with. I'd have to go back and think about it a little more. And I mean, I used to teach a whole course on the Oresteia, so it's something I think a lot about, but I haven't done it in a while. I'd have to think. I'm sorry, Stephen. I don't know if I have anything else to say about it.
All right. Well, I'd love to know your thoughts as you think about it further.
Yeah, let me, maybe if I think about it over the next hour, I'll come up with something to come back to. I mean, I don't know. Does anyone have anything to add to that? I mean, it's a good question. I don't know if I can answer it. All right. Think about it. If anyone has an idea, let me know. Susan.
So I didn't notice this in previous readings, and maybe nobody else sees it as significant, but on page 200, she mentions Martin Buber, possibly for the only time. I don't remember seeing it elsewhere, in very good company with Jaspers, but to dismiss both of them as being erroneous in thinking that this friendship or I-thou conversation could be extended to the political sphere. She doesn't really, I don't think, explain why she says that, but I just want to go on record. I disagree with that. And I think we're doing it all the time. So I just needed to mention her noticing of Buber in any case.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, she's deeply influenced by and respectful of Jaspers and Buber. Her argument is here with the idea that a thoughtful relation, right? Which is in thinking, the I-thou philosophy, or the inner dialogue, or the 2-in-1, if you go back to the chapter on Socrates and thinking, can be the foundation for politics. And the reason it can't is that in the end, it is always about me and myself and my truth. And so she introduces this, saying it can never reach the plural, the we, the true plural of action, an error rather prevalent among modern philosophers who insist on the importance of communication as a guarantee of truth. As long as you're talking, I mean, this goes back to her very important, insight that there is no truth in politics. Politics for her is about opinion. It's about plurality, and not about truth. And insofar as Jaspers and Buber, even though they create this intimacy of dialogue and interaction and appeal to myself or my other self, are still concerned with a truth, who I am, or, how to be true to the other. But they are not, and insofar as they're concerned with the truth, they don't embrace or accept the fundamental fact of politics for Arendt, which is that there is no truth. There's only opinion and plurality. And so that's the reason she says that, as great as they are and as important as they are as thinkers, that's not a political relationship. Okay, Susan? I don't know.
I mean, that helps explain why she says it.
Right. So
So
you want to say she's wrong.
I think she's wrong. Um,
So
it would-
the next question is she wrong because Jaspers and Buber are not engaged in a quest for truth, or is she wrong because there is a truth in politics?
So not being at all equipped to say that whether Jaspers and Buber are in a quest for truth, my guess would be that I disagree with that as a characterization of what their concept of communication is about. So I would say the communication would be as a form of connection with other people and not necessarily about truth. That said, the caveat being, I'm not a scholar of either. So, but that's where I think where I would come down disagreeing.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is an interesting point. And, to the extent any of you have read Jürgen Habermas's work or think of reading it, I mean, this is where someone like Habermas and Arendt depart, right? Habermas's whole premise is that politics can be imagined as a communicative speech situation, a conversation in which we come to and are, in a sense, guided by a kind of truth that emerges out of a conversation, and that there is the possibility in conversation and communicative dialogue to lead to a truth. This is exactly what Arendt disputes and rejects, and finds to be deeply problematic. Buber and Jaspers. I mean, I'll leave Buber out because I actually don't know Buber's work well at all, but I at least know a little bit of Jaspers' work, and I know some of you have been in a Jaspers group and reading Jaspers, so some of you can talk to me if you have anything to add. But Jaspers, and one of the things Arendt likes about Jaspers is his insistence on thinking as an act of dialogue and on communication. And she embraces that. And her idea of 2 and 1 in thinking is deeply influenced by Jaspers' dialogic approach and communicative approach. But she thinks that as important as Jaspers is in understanding what it means to think and in the quest for meaning, insofar as Jaspers still thinks that this communication and whatever and engaged dialogic approach leads to meaning and leads to a kind of truth, it's not political. And I don't think that's a critique of Jaspers. I think she thinks of Jaspers as a thinker, not as a political actor. And I'm not even sure Jaspers would disagree with her. I don't know. but that's where I take the disagreement to be.
Roger, can I add a question to this? You know, I highlighted that parenthetical because I think in reading this text together and alone, we've been, you know, constantly reinforcing the fact that there's some connection between thinking and evil. And that's the question that, you know, prompts this book. She's trying to understand Eichmann, who is not thinking. And I think for me, at least, when I read that part, I was a little shocked because I keep waiting for her to tell us, okay, what happens when you don't think, right? And it seems to be that for her, that category is not political, it is ethical, it's moral. And so I'm just sort of highlighting or echoing that I had this expectation, and I think the book builds to this expectation that, you know, that thinking becomes a model for something very important for her that does happen in the real world and has you know, consequences in the real world. And so when she says, by the way, in a parentheses, these two guys are wrong trying to use thinking as a model for something consequential in the world, it's kind of like, okay, what have we been doing? I'm not sure of that. And so I'm not giving an answer. I'm just kind of sort of, again, echoing some of the expectation and then the twist that happens in a parentheses.
Yeah.
So, and I'm just wondering then, do we need to really understand a separation for her between the ethical and the political?
Well, it's a good point. And we're going to read along in the next few months, along with the text on judgment, her text on thinking and moral considerations, where this will come up. And just sort of as a preview for that to some degree, you know, the problem with Eichmann, you know, is, as she says, that he doesn't think. And insofar as he doesn't think, he becomes a single, you know, an isolated one, not a two-in-one. A thinker who does think, like Jaspers or Buber or Socrates, at least questions their own perspective, and in questioning their own perspective, stops, right? The old stop and think that Arendt repeats so many times, and freezes, and the little daemon appears on over their shoulder and says, should you be doing this? Think about it. And that thus thinking can disrupt the kind of unthinking self-certainty of people who just go along and never question themselves or what they're doing. But insofar as the thinker is simply thinking, and in this two-in-one, they're still concerned with what you're calling an ethical question, right? Which she would call I guess a question of truth. It's not a political question, it's a truth question. And insofar as that, it's not political. Now, the one exception to that, which she articulates in the essay Thinking and Moral Considerations, which we'll read in a couple of weeks, is that when the thinker thinks, and in thinking stops and thinks and pulls back and says, you know, I'm not sure I can be part of this movement, or I can be part of this, they stop. And that stopping is not just thinking, that's acting, because then everyone else who's moving forward says, why are you stopping? And she says, insofar as the thinker stops and thus acts in the world as sort of a friction in the machine, right? In the gears of the machine, then the actor is not engage in a quest for truth, they become an opinion that disrupts and opposes other opinions. And thus the actor becomes political. I mean, the thinker becomes an actor, becomes political. And so thinking can have political implications insofar as the actor, the thinker, in their act of thinking becomes a kind of friction in society. And that's when the thinker moves from a thinker to a political actor. That's how she understands it, as far as I take it.
Really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. So I mean, we'll and by the way, that then raises the question of judgment, because it's a question of judgment is not a question of truth. It's a question of it's a question of taste. In Arendt's rendering, that's what we're going to read about Kant. And insofar as you know, there are different plural opinions, we have to make judgments not according to truth, but according to our taste or our judgment. And that's what we're going to be reading and talking about for the next 3 months in our inquiry into Arendt's thinking about Kant's political judgment. So it's a good transition and jump into what we're going to be doing. James.
Roger, this last chapter blew my mind. And when I got to the "but this does not concern us here" comment, I think the top of my head came off, and with total glee. But I think the paragraph before that statement seems to be a huge setup for that statement. Can you decipher for me, help me understand that paragraph before?
I'll try. Let's take a look at it. So it begins on 215. And you know, let's just set it up in that we already have on 214 one of those extra spaces. Now, I don't know if this is inserted by Arendt or by Mary McCarthy, and I'm looking forward to Thomas Barcher and Wout Cornelissen's edition, because these are the kind of things that matter. But she begins on 214 at the bottom saying, I have dwelt on Virgil's poem for several reasons, right?
Yep.
And she tells us why, that she's moving, you know, it's the moving from the church to Rome, and the riddle of foundation, how to restart time, how to found Rome anew. And then she says in the paragraph you're asking about, James, on 215, it is striking, besides, that the notion of the future, precisely a future pregnant with final salvation, bringing back a kind of initial golden age, should have become popular at a time when progress had come to be the dominant concept to explain the movement of history. So, you know, that sentence does a lot. Let's just sit there for a second. The notion of future pregnant with a final salvation, right?
Yeah.
Which has a connection to this idea of progress that we're going to, on the one hand, we're going to move progress, but on the other hand, progress never stops. So how can you have a final salvation? But on the other hand, we're moving towards a final salvation, which is progressive. But it's a future that returns us back to a foundation, an initial golden age. Why would progress turn us backwards, right? And she says, the most striking example of the resilience of that very old dream, and the dream is, of course, the initial golden age, right, is Marx's fantasy of a classless and warless realm of freedom, as prefigured in original communism, a realm that has more than superficial resemblance to Saturn's aboriginal italic rule. This is to go back to the Aeneas,
Ah,
when no laws fettered men to justice. So if you have read the Aeneas recently, James, as I had to teach it last year, which was a good review for me, in our great books course at Bard, or in our first year seminar course at Bard. The Aeneas, one of the themes of the Aeneas is the original freedom of the Italians versus the new freedom of Rome, which is secured by law and not by custom.
right.
And so what she's saying here is that the Marxist idea of a kind of communist, original communism, is prefigured in the customary freedom of Italy prior to the Roman founding. But in other books, she'll tie Marx's original communism back to the Greeks and the pre-Socratic Greeks and Aristotle's idea as well. The point is that the idea of freedom that still inspires us today, even in a post-Marxist world, is not progressive. It's fantastical, but it's also I don't want to say reactionary. That's not the word I'm really looking for. It's ancient.
Ancient, yes.
And it's a renaissance. It's a rebirth, not a new thing. And so she says, in its original ancient form, as the inception of history, the golden age is a melancholy thought, right? I mean, it is as though thousands of years ago, our ancestors had a foreboding of the eventual discovery of the entropy principle. You all know the entropy principle. Things don't go from the cold to the hot, or they, you can try it if you want, but they far better not. They always go from hot to cold, not cold to hot. That's how I learned it in physics class. But basically, the entropy principle is that things fall apart or move towards disorder. And the eventual discovery of the entropy principle in the midst of the progress-drunk 19th century, that amidst progress, things are still going to fall apart. A discovery which, if it had gone unchallenged, would have deprived action of all meaning. What actually disposed of the entropy principle, the reason we got rid of the entropy principle and believed in progress, for the men who made the revolutions of the 19th and 20th centuries, was less Engels' scientific refutation than Marx's turning, and of course Nietzsche's too, to a cyclical time concept where the prehistoric innocence of the beginning would finally return, no less triumphant than the second coming. So the what got rid of entropy and what secured progress was actually a kind of anti-progress renaissance or returning. And that's sort of the weird, deep, ultimate contradiction in the idea of progress that the 19th century embraced. Anyway,
Is she being sarcastic in the second coming? I mean, she pitching it in a certain way.
where the prehistoric innocence of the beginning would finally return. No, well, I mean, yes, I mean, she certainly doesn't think there's like a second coming, but nor does she think we're going to return to original Aboriginal freedom. I think what she's saying here is that the idea of freedom that constantly emerges, is one that is a fantasy. And that's why in the next paragraph where she says this doesn't concern us, what we are hoping to find a notion of freedom purged from these perplexities, right?
Yeah.
But we can't, and that was a hope that was more than we could actually achieve. It's just not going to happen. Our idea of freedom is always caught up in these complexities. And then she says at the end of this paragraph, in its original integrity, freedom survived in political theory only in utopian and unfounded promises of a final realm of freedom that in its Marxian version at any rate would indeed spell the end of all things. You know, Marx's idea of freedom would be the end of man because it would be the end of freedom. And these are the contradictions inherent in these ideas of freedom that she finds in the tradition.
Beautiful. That
Right.
paragraph, the paragraph that precedes, but this does not concern us here, almost feels like she bakes this beautiful wedding cake and then she pops out of it with this.
The images you give me about Hannah Arendt popping out of wedding cakes, James, are always going to be classic. I'm going to be in the stuff of my dreams and nightmares for many years. But I
I'm
appreciate it.
sorry.
But
what a setup.
Yeah. No,
What
it's
a setup.
It's a great setup. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Appreciate it. Great. Who's next? Stephen, Ruth, is that right? Stephen, you've already spoken, right? Or are you, is your hand up again?
Not this one. There are three of us, Roger.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, Stephen, you're up next. And
Okay, thank you. I'll complete the trio of Stevens today, unless there's another one out there. Roger, I want to go back, if I may, to where Susan Oberman was and where Tara chimed in on Jaspers. And I'd like to offer that it looks to me that on page 200 of Life of the Mind, Arendt is downplaying or not focusing on some of the very things she credited Jaspers with elsewhere, as in Essays in Understanding and in Men in Dark Times. And she no doubt has a reason for that, but I went back over my notes on those particular items, and there she celebrates Jaspers for his sense of what she calls humanitas, for his listening, for his trust and trustworthiness, for his patience, and for even teasing out in a discourse speech from his partners who perhaps didn't want to say anything. And to me, those are terrific citizenship virtues and would do well to be adopted in the political sphere today. And like Susan, I'm perplexed that Arendt never quite gets into what the ingredients of civil society actually are, and the terrific amount of trust and congeniality and, well, 1,000 different things fall into that. So I would just like to fly the flag for Jaspers being more, having more to say than yet another doctrine of truth or a position on meaning. These things are more, to me, as Tara was putting them in the ethical basket, they're not traditional political virtues perhaps, but it seems to me these days they're almost having to become if they've been out of fashion for a long time. So just a thought.
No, I appreciate it, Stephen. And I'm gonna sort of say what I said both to Susan and Tara, which is, like, Arendt loved Jaspers, and by the way, loved Socrates, and she reads Jaspers and Socrates somewhat in tandem, and there's not much more of a compliment Arendt can give somebody than to read them alongside Socrates. Jaspers and Socrates are the two people Arendt attributes to with thinking in the sense of humanitas and character in a way that impacts the world. So yeah, I mean, there's no critique of Jaspers here in that sense. And what she says about Jaspers is that his thinking is so extraordinary that in his thinking, his humanitas comes through, and he stands as a beacon for truth and for ethics and morality. And that is what she means by a thinker who stops and thinks and makes people pay attention to them and thus question. And she says that that's why his thinking became political, as did Socrates. So there, she has enormous respect for. I hope I didn't say anything otherwise when I talked about it earlier. But it's still a mode of thinking.
Yeah, true.
And while thinking can, in extraordinary circumstances, like a Holocaust or like a totalitarian regime or like a time of movements, become political because it interrupts the flow and makes people stop and think, thinking in itself is not political. That's her argument. And, I mean, maybe to some extent, this is one of those situations where does it really matter? I don't know, but what she wants to say is that politics, she wants to hold on to this clearly deeply important idea to her that politics is about plurality and not about truth.
Yeah.
And insofar as Jaspers and Buber and Socrates still imagine thinking as structured along the search for a kind of truth, she wants to deny that's political.
I've kind of decided, I appreciate that, Roger. I've kind of decided that when I see plurality in Arendt's writing, I'm translating it as civil society, because she doesn't mean plurality is simply a piling up of numbers of people. She means it has some sort of structure or substance to it. And that's what I think civil society has as well. And maybe those two terms are really doing the same work.
Yeah, that's an interesting. I'm hesitant there. I think plurality for Arendt emerges whenever there's a world, a common world, where people can appear,
Yes.
and they appear in their sameness and in their difference and their uniqueness. But there has to be a world, right? And so if you mean by civic society something like that, yes. When we talk about the civil society or civil sphere or what it today, we often talk about it in the Habermasian sense of, again, in his idea that in the civil society, we come together and we talk and we come to some agreement. Less so for Arendt. And so that's where I'm hesitant, although I can accept it in some ways and not in others.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Yep. Ruth.
Hi.
Hi.
I have a question about what you termed a critique of fantasies of freedom. In concerning a comment on page 205, which Arendt makes, in my view, also a bit criticizing men of action, who would, think that gradual reform is not needed. I found that interesting. And
Where is this?
It's page 205 in the first paragraph. In the middle, she writes that all those who, pressed by exterior circumstances or motivated by radical utopian thought trains, were not satisfied to change the world by the gradual reform of an old order. And I found this interesting, given the difference between liberation and freedom, which is part of Arendt's definition of revolution, pretty much. So,
right. So she's, I'm just trying to, I'm gonna say here that this is her unspoken contrast between the French and the American revolutions. So in the hiatus of time, right? I said that the structure that she sees is liberation, hiatus, foundation of freedom. The French became impatient and said, we have to force people to be free because we can't wait. And as a result, they imposed on the French nation a common truth, in which they said, we're going to you know, out of sympathy or pity for the poor, you know, kill, you know, chop off the heads, bring in the guillotine, and create a just society quickly. Not satisfied to change, you know, motivated by exterior circumstances, you know, poverty, radical utopian thought trains were not satisfied to change the world by gradual reform of an old order. And this rejection of the gradual was precisely what transformed the men of action into men of the revolutions. We're almost logically forced to accept the possibility of a hiatus in the continuous flow of temporal sequence. Look, I mean, this is about as pertinent and contemporary a question as we get today in the United States of America in 2022, right? We're in. I mean, this is an argument we've been having for 200 and some odd years in the United States, and we're having right now. Is justice something that can be done gradually? Or is justice something that we have to say, look, justice demands this now? And we're seeing this around all sorts of questions of, you know, race, gender, economics, you know, Native Americans, etc. You know, and what, you know, is this a gradual reform? Do we do this gradually? Or do we, you know, motivated by exterior circumstances and radical utopian thought trains, revolutionize it now? And you know, that's the question that's being raised here. How do you create a radical revolution? How do you create a new foundation? And there's one side that says, we know what's right and we're going to found it. And the other side says, we need to go back to the beginning and reattribute to our principles and work it through and found it over a hiatus and talk it through and understand that there's not a truth, but there's a common, you know, agreements and we have to recommit ourselves to freedom. And that's the disagreement. I mean, you see it in our country right now, or wherever you are. I'm sure it's almost in every country right now, but it's certainly a very American idea. And it's an idea that Arendt says started with the American Constitution. And look at the American Revolution, and look at the way the Americans did their revolution versus the French. The French brought out the guillotine, and the Americans made a compromise, and they created a constitution that didn't eradicate slavery, even though, you know, a certain percentage and probably a majority of the people at the Constitutional Convention wanted the Constitution to eradicate it, but they didn't. They decided to compromise and go gradually, and decided to allow the hiatus. And Arendt thought that was a more political approach. Doesn't mean it was just, but it was more political. And it was more, in her line and her reading, likely to lead to the eventual foundation of freedom. although long delayed, still delayed, right?
Well, thank you. I had the impression that she somehow criticizes also this idea of hiatus, or at least allows to think that in the end it's continuous action and in the context of contingency, but also this, let's say, foundation stories, and very much also in concerning on revolution and the foundation of the United States is maybe also was also legend, foundation legend going on, which would prevent reforms in a certain historical situation. So yeah, I found it interesting to think about this concept of hiatus as something which, yeah, unfortunately can be filled with, yeah, the kinds of fantasies about freedom, which then lead not to freedom.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's a great point, and I understand why you might have thought that. And look, I can only tell you my reading, right? Which is, I think if you read Arendt's work and you talk about, you know, she says that liberation is not the same as freedom. And it takes, she said, the American Revolution didn't found freedom. Freedom wasn't founded, you know, if it ever was, until probably after the Civil War in the United States. So I think the hiatus is very important to Arendt. I think the hiatus is a stand-in for plurality and for the idea of building a common world where we work together to found freedom, without imposing it through ideology or fantasies or guillotines or whatever.
Sure.
Okay. You know, and I could, that's just how I understand it, but
Yeah.
appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Dina, this will probably be our last question.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up about the Jaspers conversation. She certainly holds him in very high esteem, but she is somewhat critical of him in this chapter on page 189, where she accuses both him and Heidegger of a certain naivete post 1945. They had hope for Germany under Adenauer that she thinks was misplaced. And if you consider the question of German guilt by Jaspers, you might not be surprised why she has that view. And that's also textually supported, actually, in letters between Gertrude Jaspers and Arendt. And what that actually raises, which is of interest, I think, is Vergangenheitsbewältigung, this German word for overcoming the past, which is really an interesting theme in this book, because what the will really wants, right, is to undo what has happened. And this aspect of undoing or overcoming the past is actually a theme in this chapter. It's not, she doesn't discuss it vis-a-vis the Holocaust or other forms of guilt, but it's certainly something that comes up again and again in this book.
Yeah. No, it's a good point. I mean, this is a conversation that Jaspers and Arendt have their entire lives, right? And it's often the stand-in is Max Weber, right? Jaspers was I don't know if he was a student of Weber's, but a reader of Weber's. I don't know if they were, what the actual relationship was, but a big defender of Weber's patriotism and German nationalism. And in a lot of their early letters, especially, Arendt is struggling to understand Jaspers' continued belief in Germany after World War II. something that Arendt simply has lost any faith in German nationalism. There's anyway, for those, well, it hasn't come out yet, but for those of you who will, there's an article in Quillette this week that reads Arendt and Weber as interesting fellow travelers, and opposes them to Heidegger and Schmidt in their approaches to education. It'll be featured in Amor Mundi on Sunday for those of you looking for it. So in that case, Arendt and Weber are seen as, and this actually goes back to an argument that an opposition between Weber and Heidegger that's made much of by Strauss. Strauss's reading, whereas Heidegger and Schmidt at least in Strauss's reading and in this reading in Quillette, see education and the professoriate as having a job of guiding students towards a kind of inspired philosophical direction, whereas Weber and Arendt are held up as, in Strauss's work, Weber against Heidegger, Weber and Arendt here are held up as representatives of the idea that the professoriate is simply to teach people the tradition and give them the capacity and inspiration to make their own opinions about which way to go.
Mhm.
And so this is an interesting article that's just come out in Quillette that I'll be writing about for Amor Mundi for Sunday. Anyway, thank you all. This was great. I hope a year ago when people said they wanted to read the willing section, I think I expressed my skepticism a couple of times. It's never been a part of Arendt's work that I've really engaged with. And I think now I sort of understand why. I think it is a sort of, the whole willing chapter is in some ways this sort of the story of what Arendt rejects in Western thinking. How the philosophers read will as the embodiment of freedom and thus excluded politics and plurality from Western thinking. That said, I'm really glad we read it. It's something I hadn't read as a whole probably in 20 years. And it was really exciting for me to return to it. Actually 30 years. So thank you all for pushing me to do so. I hope it was enjoyable for you. We're gonna continue on with our exploration of the life of the mind through these texts that were never put together as judgment. I'm not going to claim that they are what judgment is. I don't think they are, but we're going to read as much as we can about Arendt on judgment over the next 3 months. And I look forward to doing that with you. Enjoy your break next week. Come back on the 4th to review Willing with Tara. And then we will start reading her lectures on Kant's political philosophy on February 11th. Thank you all very much. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and we'll see you soon.